This lecture is about personality psychology. When we're talking about personality psychology, what we're talking about is a study of characteristic ways of thinking, feeling, and acting. These are essentially the patterns of behavior that we engage in on a regular basis. There are many different personality theories talked about in the textbook, but I'm really just going to be focusing on two, the psychoanalytic perspective and the trait perspective. So the psychoanalytic perspective is the perspective that was started by Freud, and Freud basically thought two things. Our motives are unconscious, and personality arises from efforts to resolve conflicts between parts of our subconscious or unconscious. So Freud is historically extremely important, and that's why we talk about him. He is the father of psychology, which basically means that he started our discipline. He was actually trained as a medical doctor, but became very interested in the psychological components of illness. Having said that, though, I'm going to explain his theory, not because it's an accurate theory or a theory that modern psychologists accept, but because it's historically important. So please keep that in mind. This is not how we think about personality today. The psychoanalytic perspective likes to think of the consciousness as an iceberg. So probably you know that with an iceberg, a little bit of it rises above the water, but a vast majority of it falls under the water. So we have three different levels that Freud points to. He says that we have an ego, which is kind of like the part of the iceberg that's above water, or our consciousness, what we're aware of. We also have a superego, which he's going to refer to as our morality. And then we also have something called the id, which is our deep, dark, unconscious desires. So let's talk about each one separately. So let's start with the id down at the bottom. The id is really all about pleasure seeking. It wants to do what feels good all of the time. In particular, the id is about eating and drinking, it's about sex, it's about aggression, and Freud says that these are the things that deep down we all would like to be able to do all of the time. And if you'll note, these are all related to the 4 F's from the hypothalamus: fighting, flighting, feeding, and fornicating. He says that these things feel good to us, and knowing what we know about the hypothalamus, that actually is true because it's the pleasure center. But basically, if your id was in charge, you would be doing these kinds of behaviors without any thought of the future or the consequences. You would just do it right now because it feels good. Then there's a superego, which is kind of the voice of conscience, which is basically telling you what's right or wrong. It's what society has taught you or your parents have taught you about what is good or bad. So you can think about the id and the superego as generally wanting the exact opposite thing. The id is sort of like the little devil on one shoulder telling you to do everything you want to do, and the superego is a little angel on the other shoulder telling you no, you shouldn't. So for example, if you're faced with cheesecake, your id would say something like, go ahead, eat it, eat all of it, eat as much as you want, it tastes so good. And the superego would be more like, no, we're trying to watch our weight, it's not healthy for us to be eating so much cheesecake. So they're kind of in conflict with one another. So then the ego, the third part, is meant to deal with this conflict. So it's kind of like the mediator that has to take into account reality. It has to think about what the id wants and what the superego wants and make a decision about which it's going to go with or what kind of a compromise needs to be made. And that whatever the ego decides is what a person actually does, and it's what other people would see in terms of their behavior. So pictorially here, down on the bottom left, we have the id, or our devil, on the shoulder. In the bottom right, we have the superego, or the angel, on our shoulder. And these both interact with the ego. Remember, the ego is the mediator that's going to try and decide what to do. And then once it makes a decision, that's what actually interacts with reality, or the real world as other people see it. Because the ego is trying to make both the id and the superego happy, it experiences a lot of stress. So maybe if you've ever been the mediator between two friends who are fighting, you know that it can be really, really stressful. So Freud also proposed that we have these things called ego defense mechanisms. And these are psychological behaviors that we engage in to try and protect the ego from the stress of it dealing with the id and the superego. And we're going to talk about these more in class. This is actually one part of Freud's theory that holds some weight with modern psychologists. So how is it that we talk about measuring personality if you're talking about the psychoanalytic perspective? There's a handful of ways, and really what these are meant to do is tap into the unconscious, tap into the id, see what those base desires that you have are. So the first is projective tests. And a projective test is something like the Rorschach ink blot test, which maybe you've seen before, where they show you this ink blot and ask you, what do you see? And here are a couple of examples. And you're supposed to just say the first thing that comes to your mind. And a psychoanalyst would argue that what you say first is actually a reflection of your deepest, darkest desires. There's also a newer test called the thematic apperception test, which isn't ink blots, but ambiguous photos like this. And then they ask you to tell the story. What's going on in this situation? If you asked 10 different people, they would probably tell you 10 slightly different stories. And the argument is that whatever the story you say is going to be reflective of what's going on with you psychologically. Second, we have dreams, and we've already talked about dreams and how Freud thought that dreams had manifest content and latent content, and this is not a theory, of course, that's very valid anymore, but this is one way that psychoanalysts think that you can get into your unconscious is by looking at what your dreams are telling you. Then we have jokes. Jokes are funny because humor is one of those places that we can say things that would otherwise be unacceptable. In most situations, our superego keeps us from saying things that are rude or controversial. But under the context of humor, we can often get away with it, which is why a lot of the best comedians are the comedians that really push the envelope and say things that are quite offensive. So when you're joking, a Freudian would argue that you're actually letting out some of your deep, dark desires or your unconscious desires. And then the last are what we call slips of the tongue, or are also known as parapraxis. And slips of the tongues are Freudian slips, or when you say something that you didn't mean to. So for example, I once had a student who had a guy friend, and lots of times their other friends would give them a hard time saying that you guys aren't just friends, you can't just be friends. She was like, yeah, no, we totally are. And the guy was like, yeah, you're my breast friend. Which he didn't mean to say, but it sort of gave some clue that maybe he was thinking of her in a slightly less friendly and more sexual way. So finally, some criticisms of Freud. The first and foremost is that he's unscientific. Research efforts to try to validate his theories have come up pretty much empty. Lots of his theories are also circular and thereby can't be tested. So this is a major problem within the science of psychology. Also, some people argue that he was obsessed with sex and aggression. All of his theories were about sex and aggression, which some people think is overblowing how important those are to the human race, and some people think that actually we are pretty obsessed with sex and aggression. So of these two criticisms, the first one is actually really the dagger that shoots down Freud's theories for most modern psychologists. The other perspective I want to talk about is the trait perspective. And the trait perspective basically says that there are a handful of traits that seem to go together and that all people have these 5 traits. The major theory is called the Big Five theory, and these are the Big Five personality dimensions: openness to new experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. And you can see that the first letter, if arranged in a certain way, spells ocean. I believe the textbook gives a different mnemonic, and either can be useful in helping understand. I'd like you to read what each of these personality traits is about from the textbook. The way each one works, though, is that we all have all 5, just to varying extents. So for each of those traits, such as neuroticism, you might score low, or you might score moderate, or you might score high. Same thing for openness. You might score low, or you might score moderate, or you might score high. So nobody's lacking in any of those 5 traits. It's just we have them to different extents. So how do we measure this? Well, there's a handful of different ways. The first is the self-report. So if you asked me about me, that would be a self-report. Some critics have pointed out that personality psychologists over-rely on self-report, and that there might be biases built into a person's reflections on themselves. So in an effort to counter that, they've tried other things. They've asked strangers, so they get people together into a study who've never met one another and ask them to do a small conversation activity, and then they fill out surveys about each other afterwards. And then finally there are informant reports. So on the left here is my mom, in the middle is one of my good friends, Andrew, and on the right is an ex-roommate that I had, Hani. All 3 of these people could fill out a questionnaire about me because they all know me pretty well, and given that they've seen me in different situations and under different circumstances, they have different perspectives. So when you're talking about measurement of personality from the trait perspective, it's probably best to get some from all of these sources, and that's going to provide the most well-rounded, robust perspective on a person's actual personality. One idea that's really interesting within the trait perspective is that you actually can also measure personality by looking at the spaces we exist in without ever having actually met a person. And that's because the argument is we leave behind residues of our personality. So for example, if you're a highly conscientious person, you probably tend to organize your belongings quite a lot, and if you organize quite a lot, you probably have a clean room. So there were studies done in college dorms where they asked people to open up their college dorms to experimenters, and the experimenters went in without having ever met the person whom the room belonged to and fill out a questionnaire about their personality, just based on what their room looked like. And amazingly, the ratings of personality that the strangers who just looked at the bedroom gave matched the person's own personality ratings quite well. Another example is if you have high levels of openness, perhaps you do a lot of traveling because you're interested in finding new things in new parts of the world. And maybe when you travel, you pick things up, such as wall decorations or paintings or decorative masks. So you might have a lot of office decorations that come from different parts of the world. And a person who came into your office could maybe guess that you have a lot of openness based on those decorations. So again, our personalities leave behind a residue, not just the way that we act when we actually interact with people, but also the spaces that we live in. One of the most important things to keep in mind when we talk about personality is that to be the happiest person you can be, your personality and your environment need to fit. So your well-being is maximized when there is a good fit between who you are and the environment that you exist in. So let's imagine we have this woman here in the upper right and that she's very extroverted, meaning she's social, she likes people, she likes to talk, she's high energy, and she's also conscientious, meaning she's good at planning, details, and organization. If she has a career as an event planner, then she probably has a good personality environment fit with her job. Being a wedding planner, for example, requires you to like people, and it also requires you to be very focused on details. If we put this woman into a data entry job where she didn't get to talk with a lot of people, she probably wouldn't be as happy because she wasn't fulfilling part of her personality. Additionally, if we brought someone who is very introverted or very not conscientious to be a wedding planner, they probably would also be stressed out and not very good at that job because the people part would be overwhelming or they wouldn't be very effective at getting the details ironed out. So we'll just wrap up now with some criticisms of the trait approach. One criticism, like I mentioned before, is that there are issues in terms of how to measure it. Can you rely just on asking one person about themselves? Probably not. You probably need to take into account a lot of different perspectives. Another argument, and one that's going to be related to what we cover next week, is that this perspective, and most personality perspectives actually, undermine the situation's role. So we're going to learn that the situation has some power to make us act in certain ways. Not all of our behavior comes from who we are. Not all of our behavior comes from our personality, but these personality theories fail to see that.